Niall, thank you for being here again in Chile at the Fundación para el Progreso. We are very happy that you found some time in your very tight schedule, and now you have become a father recently. We know it's even a larger effort you have to make in order to be here. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. I just wanted to start with a very simple question, and it is, you have talked about the hypocrisy of the liberal left in the world. What is wrong with these people, with the global left, and how could we deal with this?
I think the hypocrisy of the elites was a big part of the populist backlash that we saw in the English-speaking world last year. Now, the elites of the right are not hypocritical. That is to say that they accept the implications of capitalism, that there will be inequality, and the winners will do well. The liberal left, in fact, enjoys the benefits of inequality even more, it seems to me, than the right. And yet, hypocritically, they insist that there's something terribly wrong with the consequences of capitalism. They buy Thomas Piketty's book and they engage in a kind of sub-Marxist dialogue, all the while quaffing Chardonnay on their estates in Martha's Vineyard or in their homes in Aspen. They lament endlessly the consequences of industrialization for the climate, and yet they fly to conferences to discuss climate change in their private jets. They go on the Women's March as a kind of protest against Donald Trump's sexism, and then they turn out themselves, in the case of Harvey Weinstein, to be serial harassers of women and allegedly rapists. So the hypocrisy of the liberal left is the thing that drives middle America and provincial England nuts. What they can't stand is the two-facedness of the people in the private jets in Hollywood, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, who then lecture them about their way of life, condescend to them, whether it's on religion, whether it's on firearms, accuse them of being bigots. I think it's that hypocrisy that most infuriates people. You asked what we can do about it. Actually, it's simple. Expose it. Point it out. Keep reminding people of the fundamental hypocrisy of these liberal elites who enjoy all the benefits of capitalism, but are very determined not to share them, but would in fact like to adopt policies that will reduce social mobility, will make it harder for people in the working class to rise out of the working class and into the middle class, who would rather use state subsidies to trap people in poverty, who would rather have an underclass dependent on the state than have social mobility. I think that's what we need to do. We keep needing to hammer home the hypocrisy at the heart of this particular iteration of social democracy, which I think is really what it is.
And when we go to free society and classical liberalism nowadays, and we see to a large extent this elite is an obstacle to people who believe in freedom, because they have this whole politically correct speech and they are doing all these accusations, and then you are racist, a xenophobe, and all this, and you see that also in the academia. Classical liberalism nowadays in the world, and the importance of networks in order for classical liberalism to survive. How would you depict the situation right now, and what's the reality of classical liberals nowadays? Do you see crisis among classical liberal streams of thought? We don't have enough public intellectuals like yourself, for instance, going on on the public debate and arguing against this hypocrisy and defending freedom and all these things? Or are you optimistic about the future?
Well, I think classical liberals may have fallen into a trap by endorsing globalization somewhat uncritically. And I think I find myself guilty of having done that in the past. I think we assumed that the ideas of free markets implied globalization and implied the integration of markets for goods, labor, and capital. And the more of this there was, the better for liberalism and for economic freedom. And I think we underestimated two things. First, we forgot an important lesson of the 19th century, which is that liberalism needs the nation state, that you can't really build a liberal order on what Friedrich Meinecke called a Weltbürgertum, a world bourgeoisie, that ultimately cosmopolitanism was not sufficient to legitimize classical liberalism. It needed to be embedded in a strong nation state in which the idea of citizenship was clearly associated with the identity of the nation. I think that's one of the big insights of 19th century history. And because nationalism became unfashionable in the age of globalization and began to be seen as something in fact disreputable, we drifted into the globalist camp. The other mistake we made was to fail to realize how far globalization could be rigged by oligarchs and one-party states, the extent to which globalization itself was hypocritical. To give an example, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the rules were bent to the point of breaking to allow the Chinese to go on operating a system which was fundamentally incompatible with classical liberal principles. So it was a very asymmetrical deal that was done that allowed China into a system without requiring it to apply all the rules to itself. And I think to go along with that was a mistake. We should have been crying foul much more about the concessions being made in the 1990s and 2000s to authoritarian regimes and to oligarchs. We should have been saying this is not the way that you build a liberal international order, to use a popular term of our times, that this is actually as hypocritical as the hypocrisy that we were discussing a moment ago of the social elites of the West.
And what about migration in this whole issue? I mean, if we have different cultures coming together, completely opposed cultures sometimes, like we see in Europe with the Islamic world coming into Europe, and we know all the studies that show that social capital decreases the more diverse the society is. Robert Putnam and others have shown this. How can you have a nation state when you have an extremely diverse social reality, so to speak, and with groups that don't even mingle with each other, that don't interact with each other? Are we generating or creating the basis for a crisis of the nation state in the future? Are we see at some point the Balkanization of Europe? I'm exaggerating maybe, I don't know. But how do you see this threat? Because I believe it's a threat. And of course, when you say this, again, people tell you that you are a xenophobe and all this, but I don't care. And this interview will be watched by thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people in the Spanish-speaking world. So I think they are really anxious to listen to your opinion on this.
Well, first, I need to make it clear that I'm an immigrant.
My family is.
And I immigrated to the United States. I'm married to a Somali-born asylum seeker who became a Dutch citizen and is now a US citizen, having immigrated again to the United States. And so it would be bizarre if I were to say, we have a fundamental problem with immigration. That would be wrong. Immigration has been a source of creativity, of dynamism. It has made countries like the United States and Chile what they are. And we should be very careful not to say things that seem to imply that immigration itself is a problem. The problem is not immigration. The problem is non-assimilation. The problem is the failure to integrate newcomers into the host society. Now, this did not used to be an issue in the United States, because in the United States it was very clear that the minute you got off the boat at Ellis Island, you were embarking on a process of Americanization. I recently wrote The Life of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger arrived in New York City as a refugee from Germany in 1938, and if only there had been more refugees like his family, there would have been fewer victims of the Holocaust. The minute the Kissingers arrived in New York City, he was learning English as well as working, attending baseball games, learning the rules of baseball. Kissinger is one of the few people who knows as much about baseball as he does about football, which is very remarkable, and assimilating. That was what made the American experiment so successful. Every time people would say, there's a problem with the Irish, with the East European Jews, there's a problem with the South Italians, this will never work, it would turn out to be wrong. Because one generation later, that group would have second and third generation people in Congress. So I was always skeptical of Sam Huntington's argument that the Mexicans were somehow not going to be assimilated, because I didn't see any obvious difference between where the Mexicans were when Huntington published, when was it, 10 years ago, and where the Irish and South Italians and the Jews were 100 years ago. And I think the same processes are still capable of working if Americans remain committed to the notion of assimilation. The minute the United States goes down the route of multiculturalism and says, no, you don't need to read or learn to read English, we'll make the documents available in your language of choice. You don't need actually even to attend public schools, you can have your own schools. The minute the United States goes down that route, it's on a fast track to being Europe. And Europe is really the place that I think we need to worry about.
And then there are differences, because my point mostly is about the Islamic world. Because if you take a look at, in Germany, for instance, at integration Asians, people coming from China, Vietnam, and all these countries, and Latin Americans even, or Eastern Europeans, they don't show many problems when it comes to integration and assimilation. But when it comes to people coming from the Muslim world, you have huge, massive problems all over Europe, at least in Germany, France, and countries like this. So it seems to be a difference. Like Thomas Sowell argues, there is no such thing as an abstract migrant. You have different people coming from different cultures, and they have different results when they come into your country. So now we know integration and assimilation in Europe is failing and has failed. Is it fair to argue that would it be wise to control this sort of migration and to have criteria or some kind of rules in order to accept migrants that would really benefit your society and that you know they will integrate? Because in Europe it has not worked, even though they have invested billions in trying to integrate people coming from these countries.
Well, I think there are a few points to make here. One is that labour markets, especially in Northern Europe, have done badly with almost all foreign-born workers. The unemployment rate for foreign-born workers, regardless of where they came from, is significantly higher than the unemployment rate for native-born workers all over Northern Europe. In fact, it gets worse the further north you go. And this is a legacy, I think, of what happened in the 1990s when much smaller populations came to Germany and Scandinavia and elsewhere from countries like Somalia. So I think we already had quite good evidence that at the very basic level of giving people jobs, Northern Europe didn't do well. Secondly, these countries do not have a great tradition of assimilation in the way that the United States does, and so they were much readier to buy the multiculturalist line, that they should allow people to continue using their own languages, to have their own schools, to have their own neighborhoods. And I think that was a major policy error that was made, and it was made some time ago, and it's really hard to correct once you've established those norms. Immigrant communities are self-reinforcing. People tend to migrate to where there are already people from their native land. And so it's hard to correct that. The third point is that there has been a counter-assimilation institution at work in the case of Muslim immigrants. And that institution is called the mosque. All over Europe, in mosques, in Islamic centers, Muslim schools, there is a sustained effort to keep Muslims from assimilating, to resist integration. And this is systematic. It is what my wife Ayaan Hirsi Ali has written about as dawa, non-violent extremism. And that is a major reason why the problem is specific to Muslim communities. They're the ones who are being told, do not become like the infidel. Do not let your children associate with the infidel. These are the communities where people are threatened if there's so much as seen walking down the street with a non-Muslim member of the opposite sex. I think that's a really big part of the problem. And by and large, European governments have been very slow to realize the extent to which networks of non-violent extremism have penetrated through mosques and Islamic centers, their Muslim communities. Everybody's terribly surprised when people run off to Syria to join Islamic State, as happened a lot in recent years. They wonder why this happened. But when you look at the biographies of the people who did that, they had been exposed all their lives to a refrain of do not assimilate. This is unfortunately contrary to your basic teachings as a Muslim. And Ayaan has written, I think, very thoughtfully about the cognitive dissonance you experience as a second or third generation Muslim in Germany. This is true in Turkish communities, where actually the sense of conflict between what you're being taught in the mosque and what you experience in your everyday life creates a great tension that can in some ways be resolved by saying, okay, I reject completely the secular world and I'm going to embrace Islam in its most fundamentalist version.
And one last question, Niall. What does freedom mean to you personally? I mean, from an intellectual point of view, how would you define it? Or, and how do you experience it in your own life? Like, what does it mean to you? Because I remember this interview, Charlie Rose asked Milton Friedman one time, why do you engage in this, defense of freedom so much? You could be an academic and not, go into the public sphere and debate all these people. And Friedman answered, I don't really know. It looks like he had this drive to fight for freedom, but he did not even know where it came from. So what does freedom mean to you, and why are you so committed personally as a public intellectual and academic to promote this essential value of Western civilization?
Because I was born free, and I have studied in my career the lives of the unfree, and have tried, in the way that Adam Smith recommended, to empathize with those who are unfree. Let me give you two brief anecdotes. I was writing the history of the Rothschild bank and family, and early on in my research came across a letter from one of the 5 sons of Meyer Amschel Rothschild. Amschel, the eldest, who lived all his life in Frankfurt, who was born in the ghetto. The ghetto then was a narrow street, only one street, with extraordinarily high, stacked and crowded homes. As a consequence of the French Revolution and the disruption of the laws against Jewish civil rights, for the first time in his life, Amschel Rothschild was able to buy real estate, property. And the first thing that he did was to buy a garden. And the letter that he wrote to his brothers describing his first night sleeping outdoors in the garden is one of the most moving letters I ever came across as a historian. As I read this letter and as I was writing that chapter, I thought of Beethoven. I thought of the Prisoner's Chorus in Fidelio. Oh, what joy to breathe free air. And I wept. At that moment in my life, I think for the first time I fully appreciated what it is to be free by imagining Amschel in that garden. When I met Ayaan, I met somebody who had gone on a similar journey, who'd grown up a girl in Somalia, had spent part of her childhood in Saudi Arabia, had been in the Muslim Brotherhood in Kenya, and who came to freedom through experience, through rebellion against an arranged marriage, through study at the University of Leiden, engagement with some of the great texts of the liberal canon. And she has also helped me to understand what freedom means and how much it matters, and how we have a moral obligation, an imperative, to free the people who are unfree, the people who are slaves, of which there are terrifyingly large numbers today, the people who live under unfree states in totalitarian regimes. Those people are enduring what Ayan endured as a little girl and what Amschel Rothschild endured as a young man, unfreedom. Those of us who are born free have a moral obligation to liberate, and that's my motivation.
And we hope that you will keep on with your excellent work for many decades to come, and you are a role model for us here in Chile, and I think all around the world. And I thank you very much for being here, sharing with us this time.
You're very kind.
Thank you, Niall.
Thanks.